Um, well, we have our first exam out of the way. Not bad. Y'all did pretty well on it compared to some of my other classes. Just make sure you continue to work on studying, and make sure you do the chapter quizzes. I've got some statistics if you're interested. Things like, at class average and how many people made A's, B's, C's, D's. So if you want to take a pen out and write it down, that way you can maybe compare your own grade to, what the class average was or how things worked out overall. Let's see, 10, 13, 15. 21 people took the test. Okay. We had 4 A's, with the highest grade being a 96. Very good. 6 B's. That's good. 3 D's. No, 3 C's. 6 B's, 3 C's. 2 D's. And 6 F's. So the good thing about the F's is that there was no really bad F's. The lowest grade, I believe, was something like a 50. So that's not too bad. I've had other classes where the low grade might be, in the 30s. So oh, I see Lufkin finally doing.
Just to let you know that
Okay, so Lufkin join us. I just went over the distribution of grades for those of you that just joined us. I mentioned that we had for the test we had 4 A's, 6 B's, 3 C's, 2 D's, and 6 F's. And the good thing is that even the F's weren't bad, nothing below 50. So that means everybody's still in good shape as long as you. Especially those that maybe made F's, if you improve on your future exams, and also importantly, make sure you do well and do all the chapter quizzes in the unit folders. Those are really free points. I mean, if you just do it, it's a pretty big chunk of your grade. So anyway, if you have any questions about the anything on the test, I really don't want to discuss it here. As far as specific questions or whatever, if you got questions about things, make a list and email them to me. As far as though studying, hopefully now that you've taken one of the exams, you kind of see what kind of questions I ask. And once again, and I kind of told you ahead of time that it was, if there's a person's name, I'm likely might answer or ask a question about that person. And usually it's just generally what's important about them. Like, match this person with this. Andrew Carnegie was a, billionaire steel magnate or whatever, however it was worded. And then categorization, all of the following are this except this. So hopefully by seeing kinds of questions I ask, and I'll ask the same types of questions on all the exams, that'll give you a better idea of how to really maybe study for it. It's always good to study with a friend, bounce stuff off each other. If you have somebody in class, that you can hang with, or even somebody that's not even in the class, you give them the information and they ask you questions. Flashcards are always good. Write one thing, like a person's name on one side and things about him on the other or her, and then just test yourself on flashcards. So anyway, there's a lot of different ways you can study. So anyway, like I said, if you have any more questions or deeper, thoughtful questions about the test or about specific questions, just shoot me an email, and I'll be happy to answer them as soon as I can. All right. All right, I'm going to, let's go ahead and get started on Unit 2 then, now that we kind of got that behind us. And by the way, I didn't mention the class average was almost a 74. which is very good. That's a good class average for a first exam. In the median, the class average is where you take all of the scores and you add them together and you divide it by the number of people taking the test. That's an average. The median is 76. And that is the number where half the class is above that and half the class is below that. And so that's pretty good too. It's a pretty high median. So all in all, y'all did very well compared to my other classes. So you should be proud of yourself. All right, let's see. What do we need to do? Mr. Horace, do you have a question? I think you clicked like a raised hand or something. I'm not sure. Okay. All right, we're gonna start Unit 2. Oh, okay, just checking. We'll start Unit 2. Oh, hang on, I gotta turn on my. I can't hear you right now because I've got to turn on my my speaker and screen. Hang on just a second. Okay, now I can hear you if you say something. Before I didn't have my screen on. Let's see if okay, if you remember, the last thing we talked about in the previous unit was Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis. And one of the things that he discussed was this idea that the American psyche, or almost genetically in the American DNA, was this idea of conquering frontiers, of continuing to move forward and finding new places and establishing and settling new places. Well, once we established to the Pacific Ocean, we were kind of stopped there because we weren't going to go to Canada. That belonged to Great Britain, and we had no desire to conquer Mexico at this point. So on the continent itself, are we just going to be content with that? And the answer, of course, is no. And this period that we're going to talk about in the kind of the mid to late 1800s is a period of American expansionism. Now, we're not necessarily, establishing a traditional empire where we have colonies everywhere, like the old British Empire, the old French Empire. But it's more of an economic or influential empire where we go in and we're trying to manipulate or control other countries in our favor. So anyway, so you're going to have this expansionism. So here's the reasons for expansionism. This is a good list question. All of the following are reasons for American expansionism, except. Okay, it's maybe a good question for an exam. New markets. Okay, we have the Industrial Revolution beginning. We're starting to make lots and lots of things. Okay, because we have lots of raw materials here. Not all the raw materials we need, but we have lots. And we're making things in factories. We're producing lots of goods. We're inventing things. We need people to sell it to because, just the American market's not enough if you want to grow your business. So we're looking for new markets. So we're going to try to go out and access other countries that have wealth and have money and get them to buy our stuff. So we're trying to open new markets. Also raw materials. We've got, by this point, we've got, coal, oil, timber, but there's other raw materials that maybe we don't have that is necessary for producing what we need to produce. So we might have to go find those. So we want to get access to these other countries and be influential in these other countries, so we have a steady supply of raw materials for our industry. Investment opportunities, of course. you're wanting to go out there and maybe find other people in other countries that are doing things that are deemed profitable, and maybe be able to invest in that or take their ideas. But you have to have access to these countries if you're going to be able to do that. And then finally, missionary activities. There was during this period, there was a concerted effort to expand Christian ideology, but specifically Protestantism to the rest of the world. So that's going to be an important aspect of this. A lot of the people trying to access, I won't say access markets, but it is kind of a market, I guess, a market for religion, but expanding to different places around the world for that purpose, to spread the gospel. Now, also, one of the important things that happened during this time that influenced our government and influenced others is a book that was written by a man named Alfred T. Mahan. Alfred T. Mahan wrote a book called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660 to 1783. Sounds like a very boring book to most people. And it may have been, but it was very influential to people in the Navy and the industrial side of the naval aspect of our military. And basically what he wrote and argued, he was a historian. He said, basically between 1660 and 1783, England, Great Britain, was the most powerful nation or most powerful empire on the face of the earth. There's an old phrase that the sun never set on the British Empire. And the reason, he argued, and he goes into great detail as to why, is that they had the most powerful navy. And they were able to control the seas. Not only control the seas as far as protecting and expanding their military presence and their colonies, but also using that navy to protect the trade routes on the seas, from colony to colony, from nation to nation. So a requirement, really, to be a powerful nation on the earth, according to Mahan, is you had to have a powerful navy. Okay, and this was read by very important people in the U.S. Navy, including young Teddy Roosevelt. Also, it was read by other nations. So other nations were thinking about this too. And what it's going to lead to, and we'll see this in a little while, is to the expansion of our Navy, a modernization of the U.S. Navy, which will basically, like Mahan said, it's going to help the United States in the early 20th century, or the early 1900s, greatly expand their influence and power. So Mahan's very important. Now, the first real venture, I guess, into expansionism. When I say expansionism, I'm just meaning moving beyond the United States' traditional borders in order to expand their power, was the purchase of Alaska from Russia. Of course, you know, Russia, we looked at the maps early in your History 1 class, where the Bering Strait, where the first migrants from the crossed over from Russia into Alaska, hunting bison or whatever, elk or moose. Well, Alaska's right there. You can see Russia from Alaska. You can see Alaska from Russia. And Russia controlled Alaska and basically owned it for many years. But hang on just a second. Give me just a second, guys. Just beware, they're getting ready to do an alarm test, so if the sirens go off in just a second, I'm going to mute the microphone, and we'll just hold loose for a minute. Anyway, the purchase of Alaska by our Secretary of State Seward. Now, I believe this was during the Lincoln administration or shortly afterwards that they decided to purchase Alaska. They just saw it as an opportunity to, have a buffer maybe up there, maybe some influence in Canada, and maybe even in Russia. But and so they bought this big, huge chunk of ice that is called Alaska. And the funny thing is, nobody thought it was worth anything, and that's why they call it Seward's Folly, because folly is the silliness or something stupid you've done. You've done something that's a folly. Well, come to find out, in the short term, it may have been a folly because there was really nothing important or valuable about Alaska when it was first purchased. But in the mid 20th century, in the mid 1900s, mid 50s, 60s, and 70s, they discovered something about Alaska that made it very, very valuable, and that is boatloads of oil underneath Alaska. And so a lot of our oil in the late 20th century came from Alaska. All right, we've got some noise going on right now, so we're going to pause a minute. This is what it sounds like. It's still going off for just another minute or so, I can't talk at the same time. It bugs me, so y'all just chill out for just a second. And yes, ear splitting fun, thank you. And you're getting it secondhand. It's really ear splitting if you're in here. I'll go ahead and put that PowerPoint thing back up in case you guys are wanting to write it down or copy it or whatever. So while we're waiting. All right, I think we've been set free from that noise. All right, so we talked about Alaska. Okay, so that was the first real step in our expansionism, this idea that we're going to expand beyond our borders. And Alaska, if you know anything about world geography, is part of really its southern border is the Pacific Ocean, and in the Pacific and leading through the Pacific to Asia was one of the ultimate goals of the expansionism, because we already had long-standing historical trade with Europe, which was a large market for us, but it was an established market. We've been dealing with Europe for a long time, but the prize, and we're going to talk a lot more about this as this unit especially goes on. The real prize was Asia, in markets like Japan and China, where not only could we sell things, but there's a lot of raw materials and things they produce and sell that we want. So the early focus was Asia, and Asia, Southeast Asia, and islands in the Pacific. And of course, if the Pacific Ocean is huge, so you're going to have islands and places to stop off, on the way for your ships. And one of the first islands to be acquired really by the United States was the island of Samoa. I believe it was already an island that partially had been discovered and settled by Germans. And through some negotiations, we were able to kind of divide the island amongst ourselves, or the Germans, or it's a chain of islands, and distribute it out. But Samoa became the first Pacific island that we really established ourselves with a military presence and a permanent presence. The next was Hawaii. Hawaii had been an important island out in the Pacific for a long time. It had been a lot of sugar cane, and sugar had been grown and produced out there for many decades. And there was a long presence of some of these important businessmen who profited from the sugar cane. Now, sugar is a very popular product. I mean, today it just seems like it's everywhere, but back then it was like gold almost, or something very, very valuable. And as it became more influential and more desired product, the importance of the Hawaiian sugar industry became more and more important. Also, that led to Americans wanting to profit from it and be part of that sugar boom, I guess, if you will. And so there's Hawaii out there, just kind of an independent nation on its own, and then something happens. The United States passes what is called the McKinley Tariff. And a tariff, we already talked about this a little bit. A tariff is basically just a tax on trade. And usually an import tariff are the main tariffs, and that's a tax on imported goods. The goal of an import tariff or an import tax is to raise the price on foreign goods so the people buy domestic goods. So if we're growing sugar in the United States, or sugarcane and producing sugar in the United States, and they're producing sugar in Hawaii, but the sugar in Hawaii is better quality and they can sell it cheaper because of cheaper labor, well then people are going to buy the Hawaiian sugar off the shelf, and the sugar business in the United States is going to fail. So the goal of a tariff is to tax every bit of sugar that comes in from Hawaii. And it wasn't just Hawaii, there were many other tariffs, but tax the imports from Hawaii, make them cost, for every pound of sugar you tax it enough to where the eventual price, when it goes to market to the eventual buyer, the price is going to be higher than the domestic sugar being sold. So therefore people buy the domestic sugar from wherever, and wherever in the United States, but it keeps the jobs in the United States, it keeps the sugar business in the United States going, and it's good for the US economy. Okay, so that's the positive of an import tariff, okay, is that it makes you buy American goods, and therefore keeps American workers working. There's a drawback to the import tariff. It makes the stuff cost more, because if you can buy cheaper Hawaiian sugar, but they tax it to where it's more expensive than the American sugar, then you're actually having to pay more for every bit of sugar you buy because of the tax on the Hawaiian sugar. But it's a trade-off. So back then, there was a lot of people that believed that the trade-off of putting tariffs on imports was a good thing. So import tariffs. Now, when that happened, that means Americans quit buying Hawaiian sugar cane or sugar. So the business people in Hawaii hatched a plan. They wanted to become part of the United States. And so what they did, the local businessmen, which were, many of them had been in Hawaii, a couple of generations, but they decided to overthrow the independent monarch, Queen, I'm going to try to get this right, Liliuokalani. I think I got that right. Queen Liliuokalani, and established their own government and immediately asked for annexation. Okay. Now at the time, Grover Cleveland was president, and he did not like how this was working. He did not like this overthrow of a sovereign government in order to just sell more sugar. So he rejected the bid for annexation by the United States, because if you're part of the United States, then you can ship sugar into the United States without a tariff. And that was the whole point. So he refused to annex Hawaii, so Hawaii established their own republic, the Republic of Hawaii, after they ousted the Queen. But once later, when William McKinley actually becomes president, and it was his tariff when he was a member of Congress that caused all this ruckus, they later go ahead and annex the United States, and of course eventually it'll be made a state. But we always talk about Texas and how Texas is unique because they have a history of being an independent republic, and the Republic of Texas. But we're not the only one. Hawaii has a fairly interesting backstory as well. So anyway, so now Hawaii, the Samoan Islands, and Alaska. So it's where we're moving outside of our borders, expansionism, and chipping away towards Asia. So here's a map of the Pacific. Let me increase the size of this a little bit if I can. That's not going to increase. Okay, so we got Alaska up here, 1867. So it was after the Civil War. Alaska is acquired. Samoa down here, way down at the bottom, is acquired, and then Hawaii, the Hawaiian Islands, right here. So north, south, and in between, basically, as far as the Pacific goes. And that's probably a pretty good strategy if you're wanting access to all the Asian markets over here, including China. Oop, too big of a thing. Japan. China's down here. And then the Philippine Islands. And then what we call Southeast Asia right down in here. So, so anyway, the goal is to, have access from the United States and reach across the ocean there for raw materials, for markets, and for all those other things that we talked about. And the first steps were those islands. Then we have another event closer to home that leads to expansionism. I'm trying to increase the size of this. It's not letting me. Anyway, sorry about that. The Spanish-American War. The Spanish-American War begins with a Cuban rebellion in 1895. Cuba, which if you don't know where that is, that's like just south of Florida, the tip of Florida where Miami is, in the kind of the Caribbean Sea. Cuba had long been a colony of Spain, just belonged to Spain. Of course, Spain, used to own Florida and all those other islands down in there, but Cuba itself was a colony of Spain, and they had uprisings and revolts of the Cuban population for years in Cuba against the empire, the Spanish Empire. But nothing ever really came of it. They was usually suppressed pretty quickly. But in 1895, there was a pretty significant rebellion that occurred in Cuba. And the difference this time is that the United States, and especially the United States media, newspapers, paid attention. And in this expansionist attitude now that we have, some of the most important people in either promoting it or squashing it were editors of the big newspapers, the New York Times, Washington Post, these very powerful newspapers. And one of the most influential newspaper publishers was a guy named William Randolph Hearst and another one named Joseph Pulitzer. Okay, these were the top dogs. And what they decided how their newspapers would tell stories could change the opinion of a whole nation. Well, they started telling stories about the horrors that were perpetrated upon the Cuban people by the Spanish Empire and how terrible the Spanish Empire was to them, when in reality, they weren't that bad. Of course, any empire that suppresses a people and forces a form of government on them, we consider as Americans, much like our historical colonial past, as bad. But it wasn't that bad. But the newspapers made it out to be much, much worse than it was thought to be. So it riled up popular opinion for the Cuban Revolution against the Spanish. And when you have popular opinion being being stirred up, that sometimes forces the government into action. If everybody's all riled up because of what they read in the newspaper, well, why isn't the government doing something? So the government is being pressured into, supporting the Cubans, either militarily or any other way. Grover Cleveland, when this was first started, Grover Cleveland refused to. He didn't want to get involved in any expansionism at this point. He definitely didn't want to get involved in a war with Spain. But once his term is over and William McKinley takes office, he's much more open to this idea of expansionism. Okay, and we're talking about the very late, the 1890s right now. Now, while this was all going on with the yellow journalism and this revolt and uprising in Cuba, a couple of things happened. First, a guy named, I can't remember his first name, but his last name is Delome. He is the Spanish ambassador to the United States. Of course, Spain is the empire that controls Cuba. Well, he wrote a letter to somebody back home in Spain that was intercepted by pro-Cuban people and sent back to the United States. And the letter was basically a letter that was very personally critical of President McKinley. Called him weak, called him a pandering person who only did what the public wanted, and just said a lot of really nasty things about him. And of course, the newspapers loved this. They published it all over the place, and it showed the disrespect Spain had for the United States. And so that stirred up even more anti-Spanish sentiment in the United States. Then something much more sad happened. We had sent an American Navy ship called the USS Maine into the waters around Cuba, just to kind of monitor things, protect our interests, make sure Spain's not going to, come up into the, any harbors on Florida or whatever. So it's just there. And then one day it exploded and sank, and hundreds of naval personnel died in this sinking. Very quickly, the Navy's investigating, and they really can't determine exactly what caused it. Of course, yellow journalism is that type of journalism that I was just talking about, that exaggerates things for a political purpose, exaggerates things and embellishes things to make people believe something when maybe they could instead just give the facts. It's more than facts. Well, they embellished and used yellow journalism on this USS Maine story, and basically accused Spain of mining the harbor that the Maine was in and sinking the ship, when there was no evidence that that's what happened. But they stirred it up anyway. And so it pushed McKinley towards war, pushed Congress towards war, because the public pressure was such that it pushed them towards war. And just a note, they did future investigations into this sinking of the Maine, even as recently as a few decades ago, and they believe it was an explosion from the where the coal was stored, where that powered the ship, and it was not Spanish. Spanish didn't do it, but they're going to be blamed for it. And so Congress declares Cuba independent, which basically declaring war on Spain, because they're saying, okay, this is your colony and we're declaring it independent. So Spain's going to say, well, we're going to protect our interests, we're going to protect our colony. So the United States declares Cuba independent, but there was a lot of debate. There was a lot of debate in Congress before they would vote on this. And one of the debates was an anti-expansionism debate. Everybody wanted Cuba free. They believed in an independent nation. Everybody in Congress, I mean, they wanted a free and independent Cuba, because we believe in, self-determination of government. But there was a lot of people worried that the United States would eventually annex Cuba and make it part of the United States. And they didn't like that. They didn't think Cuba should be part of the United States. They didn't think it should be a colony of ours, because that's not what we do. We're not an empire. So in order to get those people to vote for the declaration of war, or to vote for the Declaration of Independence for Cuba, they had to add something called the Teller Amendment. The Teller Amendment. It's just an addition to the Declaration. And the Teller Amendment says, when the war is over and Cuba is free and wins, the United States will make no claim on Cuba. Cuba will be handed over to the Cuban people for them to rule. Okay? So basically saying, we can't annex Cuba. We can't make Cuba part of the United States. And so that was the only way Congress was going to, take the next step. And so they declare Cuba independent, add the Teller Amendment that says we will not own Cuba when it's all said and done. And so with this, McKinley signs a declaration of war against Spain. Ironically, even though it's the Spanish-American War and it's over the nation of Cuba, probably the most important event happens in the Philippines. Okay, the most important event happens in the Philippines, which if we go back, I can show you those islands. It's a long way from Cuba. Okay, here are the Philippine Islands. Okay, and Cuba is way over here. Okay. But the reason the Philippine Islands are important is because they too belong to Spain. Okay. Now, the Spanish Armada, which is their navy, a large chunk of it was stationed in the Philippines. And we had a naval fleet out that way, led by Commodore George Dewey, who knew that. And so he creeps up into Manila Bay, which is where the ships of that the big chunk of the Spanish Armada are stationed, and basically attacks. They're not expecting it. They're thinking, oh, this is just this battle with the United States over Cuba is just going to be a minor thing that'll take place halfway across the world. But no, the United States under Dewey quickly and seriously damages the Spanish fleet. And this is the same fleet that was probably going to eventually, once the war began in earnest, come to the aid of the Spanish in Cuba. So it dramatically cripples Spain's ability to protect Cuba. Now, inside of the Philippines, much like in Cuba, there had been this continuing revolt and uprisings against Spain. And one of the people who led this within the Philippines, was a guy named Emilio Aguinaldo. Emilio Aguinaldo. And Emilio was the pro-freedom fighters of the Philippines. And he sees this happening. And he says, all right, this is great. While the United States is handling the bay and taking out the Spanish ships, my people will fight on land. And knowing the United States as we know them, they're going to help us get our independence. And our revolution will be a success. So Aguinaldo assists in taking the city of Manila, and eventually will try to claim leadership in the Philippines. But we'll get back to that in just a little while. Back in Cuba, our Navy, the U.S. Navy, blockades Santiago Harbor, which is one of the main harbors in Cuba. No ships in or out. Sends 17,000 troops, including a young, whippersnapper named Teddy Roosevelt and his Ivy League educated buddies who loved nothing but an adventure. And they knew this would be kind of an adventurous, easy war to win that they could fight in and get some glory. And they come in and they fight. They call themselves the Rough Riders, and they come in and fight for the United States against the Spanish Empire. And of course, they're famous for taking San Juan Hill and being, getting credit for that. But history has noted that it's very likely that they weren't the original ones that took San Juan Hill. Supposedly, there was a black regiment that went up and took that hill before, and secured it before Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders went up there. But then, of course, Teddy Roosevelt went up there and took credit for it. But that was not uncommon back then, much like Columbus claiming the first to see land when discovering America, when it was really somebody else that saw it and he took credit for it. So anyway, so basically the war ends quickly. I mean, Spain has no ability to resupply their troops. They have no ability to bring in reinforcements, and the United States is right next door to Cuba, offering all the troops and all the assistance that they need. So the writing's on the wall, and the war ends. The Spanish-American War ends very, very quickly. It doesn't take long. So the end of the Spanish-American War. As promised in the Teller Amendment, Cuban independence. Okay, Cuba becomes an independent nation, but the U.S. will get some things out of this war. Of course, if you beat an empire, by definition, empire means it's the main country, the mother country, plus other things that they have acquired and other things they own around the world. So in the spoils of war, in the negotiation to end the war, you get to get stuff. And the two things we got, well, besides Cuban independence, was Puerto Rico and the Philippine Islands. Okay, Puerto Rico and the Philippine Islands. One of the, hang on, let's, okay, I think it stopped. And one of the, first of all, let's talk about the war itself. there were very few American casualties. And actually, more people died from disease in the tropical weather, mosquito-borne diseases like malaria or yellow fever, something like that. More people died from that than actual combat. So there wasn't a whole lot of resistance from the Spanish. They knew the writing was on the wall. So there were minimal casualties in the Spanish-American War. Most died from disease. And one of the first things they did with regard to Philippines, as opposed to Cuba, which they couldn't, is they annexed the Philippines. They annexed the Philippines. And there's a couple of reasons why they did it besides, and then didn't Cuba. One was national glory. You had to show the people back home something and show the world something, a trophy or something. And one of the trophies, and a major trophy, was the Philippines, the Philippine Islands. So that was a reason. Also, commerce. Remember the islands that we already had, or the stepping stones that we already had towards the Asian markets, towards China, which was originally Alaska, Hawaii, and Samoa. Well, guess what? Now we're right on the border of China with the Philippine Islands. So that gives us even better access to all of these markets that we were wanting. Another reason was racial superiority. Okay, the Filipino people were a different race, and a more Asian race, and of course, at the time, the Anglo leaders of the United States saw themselves as superior to all races, and therefore justified their annexing these people and implementing their government on them. And then evangelism. These are potential Protestant conversions. Simple as that. These are people that we can convert to the Protestant faith and expand our religion. The Treaty of Paris is the treaty that ended the Spanish-American War. And there was opposition to the Treaty of Paris. There was a lot of opposition in the United States, especially the part about the annexation of the Philippines. They argued that it violated the principles of independence and anti-colonialism. They always go back to this idea. Look, we fought a revolution here in the United States because we didn't want a foreign power telling us what kind of government to have, making laws for us and making rules for us. Why are we now doing the very same thing that we fought a revolution for? Okay, so there was opposition to the Treaty of Paris, but nonetheless, it was passed, and the Philippines and Puerto Rico became part of the United States, annexed as part of the United States. Not states, but just their territories of the United States. Now, the person that this really upset, this annexation of the Philippines, was Emilio Aguinaldo. Remember him? He was the freedom fighter in the Philippines who helped the United States take Manila and had the hopes of having a free and independent Philippines. Well, he wasn't happy. So the war that he had been waging against Spain, he now will wage against the United States and the Philippines. And it is one of the most brutal wars that probably we've never really learned about in history, or learned enough about it. Some horrible atrocities were perpetrated upon the Filipino people as they were trying to fight for their freedom. Hundreds of thousands of Filipinos were killed in this war, and a few thousand American deaths. So it was very lopsided, and it was very brutal. There were atrocities on both sides, but massacres and things like that. But you can just tell by the numbers of dead that somewhat one-sided. But nonetheless, eventually we subdued the Philippines, and that becomes a territory of the United States. Religion and empire. The Protestant majority, often, which was the big majority in the United States, supported war and acquisition of colonies for all the reasons that we've talked about, but mainly for that evangelism, the evangelical missionary work, and being able to spread the word. Of course, there's also many of those same evangelicals and stuff are businessmen who are going to profit from the annexation of the Philippines. Racial superiority and religious conversion, and quite the hint of anti-Catholicism. Okay, Catholicism was not necessarily mainstream at this point in the United States. Today, it is considered a very mainstream religion. Nobody, there's very few, if any, real, except for specific issues maybe currently with the Catholic Church. Most people just don't, hate the Catholic Church or fear the Catholic Church. Whereas back then, worldwide at least, the Catholic Church was much more powerful, and therefore it was seen as much more of a threat to the Protestantism, the majority Protestantism of the United States. So that played a part. And the Philippines there was a lot of Catholicism in the Philippines. Okay, so we've got these new territories. How are we, and this is over a few years, okay? Because the war ends in the late 1890s, so now we're having to go through a process of integrating these new territories and things into the United States. So in the Philippines Government Act of 1902 made it an unorganized territory, meaning we had people there that were controlling it, but they didn't have any really form of government, at least government especially by the Filipino people. So it was kind of run as just a piece of property of the United States for 15 years. But then the Jones Act was passed in 1917, which gave the Filipinos their own elected legislature and the intention of granting them independence, the promise of independence. So after the long war, probably long after Emilio Aguinaldo is dead, he's going to get his dream of an independent Philippines. But it's going to be in the future. And then the Tydings-McDuffie Act of 1934 was a new law that offered specific timetable for independence and offered independence in 10 years, so 1944. Now, this is important because once that happened and the Philippines, the Filipino people saw that independence was there, within sight, they become much less anti-American. And especially this is important, is the location of the Philippines during World War II in the Pacific as we were fighting Japan. Many Filipinos fought with the Americans, and the Philippine Islands were an important piece of the war as far as strategically for the United States. Puerto Rico, which is that island is down there, in the Caribbean, deeper into the Caribbean and more towards the Atlantic Ocean than Cuba. But the Foraker Act of 1900 set up a civil government, so gave them their own civil government. The Jones Act, which is the same act that gave the Philippines an elected legislature, grants U.S. citizenship to the people of Puerto Rico. So the Puerto Rico is not a U.S. state. It is I guess you would call it a commonwealth. But the people that live there are U.S. citizens. Okay? The people that live there are U.S. citizens. And prior to Hurricane Maria, which pretty much wiped out that poor island, it was a popular place to vacation, like a Caribbean kind of vacation, where you didn't need a passport because you could fly from the mainland United States into Puerto Rico and back without a passport. And so it was a popular destination, but now, after the ravages of Hurricane Maria, it's no longer really a destination for a vacation, and hopefully they get rebuilt quickly. In 1952, they become an official commonwealth of the United States with a constitution. Okay, so they have their own constitution, but they're really a unique piece of the United States, as they're not a state, but they're a commonwealth, and there's not too many of those out there. Now, Cuba. Remember the Teller Amendment said that Cuba's independent and we're not going to control it. Well, Cuba's too important. It's too close to the United States. It has too many valuable assets in it, like beautiful beaches, sugarcane, and other crops, tropical, fruits and things like that. So the Congress passed the Platt Amendment in the early 1900s. Basically, the Platt Amendment overturns the Teller Amendment. And the Platt Amendment says that the United States may unilaterally, meaning their own decision, they don't have to have the agreement of the Cuban government or the Cuban people, but the United States can unilaterally interfere in Cuban affairs if they feel it is necessary for the quote-unquote stability of Cuba. So basically that gives the United States free rein to just, if they don't like what's happening in Cuba, they can just go in and do whatever they want to fix it. And it's going to lead to many conflicts, not necessarily conflicts, but I don't know what the proper word is for this. The people of Cuba are going to resist, and they're not going to like it very much. But there's really nothing they can do, and it sets the precedent for future intervention into Cuba, and not just into Cuba. It kind of sets the precedent for future intervention by the United States into other Caribbean and Latin American countries, specifically Central America, which we'll talk about as we go further into this this unit. Oop, there we go. Here's a good map that shows this. Okay, here's the United States, obviously, Florida, and there's Cuba. Okay, right close to just by seeing the map, you understand why it's important to the United States. You can understand why it's important to the United States. Here is Puerto Rico. It is kind of out there, almost in the Atlantic, within the Caribbean Sea. That map is not in the book. No, it's not. I got this map from somewhere else. There should be a similar map, something that shows this, I would hope, in the book. I can't remember if it is. Okay, yeah, so it's page 766. Then this, in any good history book will have a map. When we're talking about this part of our history, they'll have a map. But anyway, so the United States in this, let's see, what's cool about this map, I don't know if the map in the book shows it, but it shows the years that the United States intervened in all of these places. Nicaragua down here, Cuba, look at all these years in which we occupied Cuba after the Platt Amendment, which overturned the Teller Amendment. Okay, very good, exact same info, just looks different. Haiti, Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic. So as you can see, the U.S. is claiming it's not an empire, but it's acting like an empire. And this will set a standard for what we will do up and until this very day. This is what the United States does. They will use other ways than just colonizing places to influence them through political pressure of existing governments, or through economic means, getting control or influence within a country. A good example is the Middle East and access to the oil of the Middle East, and how we've used our political and military capabilities to ensure we have access to those nations and their oil. All right, we'll start a little bit on this. This is a lot. We'll talk about Asia a little bit. Now, remember, Asia is the goal. Europe is not a goal. We have access to Europe. We have access to all that. So that's nothing new. The new prize is Asia, but it's also the prize for many of the other major players in the world, like Russia, Germany, France, and Great Britain. They all want access to the Asian market, specifically China. China is the most populous country on the face of the earth then, as it is now, though India is catching up with it pretty quickly. And the United States, because they know everybody is wanting access to China, and especially Russia is much more closer proximity to China, we're just north of it and west of it, that the United States issues something called the open door policy. Open door policy. And much like if y'all remember from your first American history class, if you took it, I'm not going to ask any questions about it, but there was something that the United States did called the Monroe Doctrine. And it was basically telling the world that we're going to protect Latin America from any more European colonization. This was back in the 1820s or the 18 teens. And the rest of the world ignored it and kind of kind of huffed and puffed and said, look at those idiots over in America thinking that they're going to, tell us what they're going to do anywhere in the world. Well, the world kind of looked at the United States the same way in the early 1900s when they issued the open door policy, which basically said that China will be having open doors to any and all trade equally. In other words, no one single nation will dominate trade and the economy in China. And he's basically talking about, and the United States is basically talking about Russia, Germany, France, Great Britain, some of these major empires. Of course, when they're claiming the United States is stating that China will remain open to everybody, everybody has access equally, there's one people that they did not ask about this. The Chinese people, the Chinese government. They in no way, conferred with them with regard to the United States telling the world that China's open for business. They didn't ask the Chinese if they could do that. And there was a faction within China who didn't like this, and they rejected it, and they formed a resistance. And that resistance built up to the point to where it led to an outright revolt or rebellion, and it was called the Boxer Rebellion. And basically the Boxer Rebellion is just a rebellion of nationalist Chinese, people that wanted to maintain control of their own country and resist outward influence in their own country. And so they rose up in arms and began to fight these foreign influences coming into the country. And it took a coalition of international countries, including somewhat the United States, but Russia and Great Britain, to put down this rebellion. So now we're using force to maintain our access to these foreign markets that we're working for. There's a lot to go on with Roosevelt. We're not going to have time to finish it in the next 10 or 15 minutes. So let's stop here, and we'll start the next class with Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy, because there's a lot going on with good old Teddy Roosevelt. And so anyway. Any questions about today's class or anything else you might? Like I said, if you have a question about the test, just email me that. But if there's any questions about the class or what's coming up, no? All right, just go ahead and sign out for those of you that are at home. You guys have a good weekend, and we will see you on Monday. You're welcome.